What is up, party people? It's Keys Dan with RadioWhat.com, DJLittleRock.com, coming to you live and in living color from the Radio What studio. And this is my podcast, What Makes You Famous. It's an extension of the RadioWhat.com internet radio station that I've been running for quite some time. And if you need DJ services, where do you go? DJLittleRock.com. Check availability and get a free price quote. And maybe you could have me. Oh yeah, I like to play for the people at your next event. You know, I like weddings and parties of all kinds. Video dance party karaoke jams have been what's going on lately. If you'd like to tell your story, I encourage you to check out my other podcast, What Makes You Famous. Find it everywhere using the hashtag What Makes You Famous. Now, on with the show. Today on the program, 10 things you need to know today. Saturday, June 13th, 2020. 10 things you need to know today. Number 1, CDC strongly encourages protesters and rally attendees wear masks. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's latest guidelines, introduced Friday, recommended organizers of large events, quote, strongly encourage, end quote, participants to wear cloth masks to prevent the spread of coronavirus. The guidance comes as protests against police brutality and systemic racism continue nationwide, and as President Trump prepares to hold campaign rallies again starting next week. Before heading to a big event, the CDC recommends everyone evaluate how many people they'll be around, how close they'll be to those people, and for how long. All of those factors can increase one's risk of contracting COVID-19, the CDC says. This is according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and the Washington Post. Number 2, Cuomo signs New York police reform bills. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, Democrat, on Friday signed a package of bills aiming to reform aspects of policing in the state, including banning chokeholds and repealing a decades-old state law that has kept police disciplinary records secret. The bills also include measures making it easier to sue people who call police on others without good reason. The changes come amid nations against police brutality and racial injustice, which have prompted discussion and actions on how to reform policing in the United States. Cuomo now has 10 days to act on other bills passed by lawmakers this week, such as legislation prohibiting police from using racial profiling. A top New York City police union criticized the bills, arguing the new measures will make their jobs more difficult. This is according to the New York Times and Fox News. Number 3, Trump reschedules Tulsa rally planned for Juneteenth. President Trump on Friday evening tweeted he is rescheduling a rally that was set to take place in Tulsa, Oklahoma on June 19th. Juneteenth, the commemoration of the end of slavery in the United States, takes place that day, and the president said many of his African-American, quote, friends and supporters, end quote, suggested changing the date, quote, out of respect for this, quote. The rally will be moved back a day to June 20th. Trump had received criticism for scheduling the rally on Juneteenth, but it wasn't just the date that people found objectionable. Tulsa was the site of a massacre of hundreds of African-Americans in 1921. And Trump's critics said the decision to hold a rally there, quote, is disrespectful to the lives and community, end quote, that were lost. This is according to NBC News and CNN. Number 4, Trump administration finalizes rollback of transgender health protections. The Trump administration Department of Health and Human Services finalized a rule on Friday that will roll back health care protections for transgender people. The rule, established along with the Affordable Care Act, prevents healthcare workers from denying transgender patients healthcare by banning discrimination on the basis of, quote, gender identity, end quote. When HHS announced its plans to scrap this policy, advocacy groups and lawmakers alike began criticizing the move as damaging to a vulnerable group of Americans. The new policy will allow healthcare providers to further lean on religious exemptions. In its announcement, HHS said the move, quote, will eliminate mass confusion that was unleashed by the Obama-era decision, end quote. The nonprofit Human Rights Campaign quickly announced a legal challenge to the rule. This is according to Axios and HHS. Number 5, Beijing retightens restrictions after 53 coronavirus cases linked to a market emerge. Beijing authorities shut down the largest wholesale food market in the Chinese capital Saturday, as well as residential communities in the surrounding area. More than 53 people tested positive for the coronavirus in the city. Nearly every infected person had worked or shopped at the Qinfadi market, where the virus was reportedly detected on cutting boards for imported salmon. Of the 53 cases, 46, all market employees, were asymptomatic at the time of diagnosis. The outbreak comes more than 50 days since Beijing saw its last reported local coronavirus case, and the city had slowly been returning to normal. Now Beijing is tightening traffic controls into and out of the city. Paramilitary police reportedly stand guard outside the market, and plans to relax some restrictions have been reversed. Officials said they will set up temporary open-air trading posts so fruit and vegetables remain available. This is according to the New York Times and the Associated Press. Number 6, Bolton's book will accuse Trump of more Ukraine-like transgressions. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton's forthcoming book will detail more, quote, Ukraine-like transgressions, end quote, by President Trump, the book's publisher said on Friday. Bolton's book, The Room Where It Happened, is set for release later this month, and Simon & Schuster said he, quote, argues that the House committed impeachment malpractice by keeping their prosecution focused narrowly on Ukraine when Trump's Ukraine-like transgressions existed across the full range of his foreign policy, end quote. He will reportedly detail, quote, exactly what those were, end quote, and describe how he and others raised alarms. Bolton did not testify during the House's impeachment inquiry, which focused on Trump pushing Ukraine to investigate former Vice President Joe Biden and ended with Trump's acquittal in the Senate. The White House has been trying to prevent Bolton's book from being published. This is according to CNN and The Week. Number 7, near universal majority of Americans support changes to policing. A, quote, near universal, end quote, majority of Americans support at least some changes to policing, according to a survey by HuffPost's YouGov released Friday. However, fewer than a third of Americans support defunding the police, as opposed to other reforms like banning police chokeholds, which is backed by 73% of the population. Importantly, there is a lack of clarity around what it means to, quote, defund the police, end quote. Most respondents agreed the phase means, quote, significantly decreasing a size of police forces and the scope of their work, end quote. But some interpret the phrase as, quote, completely abolishing, end quote, police forces. Americans are nearly even split on, quote, budgeting less money for your local police department and more for social services, end quote, which is what some say the goal of, quote, defund the police, end quote, activists. This is according to HuffPost. Number 8, Academy to introduce new representation and inclusion standards for Oscar eligibility. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences on Friday announced plans to implement, quote, new representation and inclusion standards for Oscars eligibility, end quote. While the Academy didn't specify what these requirements might entail, the New York Times notes the Oscars could emulate the British Film Institute, which started requiring entrants in some categories meet diversity standards. Quote, while the Academy has made strides, we know there is much more work to be done in order to ensure equitable opportunities across the board, end quote. Academy CEO Don Hudson said. The Academy has long faced criticism over the lack of diversity in its Oscar nominees. The new standards are to be decided by an Academy task force by July 31st, though they won't take effect at 2021's show. This is according to the New York Times and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Number 9, gunman injures 8 in San Antonio bar shooting. A man shot and injured at least 8 people in a parking lot Friday night after he was turned away from a bar in San Antonio, Texas, police said. The gunman reportedly fled the scene. and police are still searching for him, though San Antonio police officer Chief William McManus does not believe there is any risk in the area. The shooter was reportedly part of a group, all of whom were told to leave at the door because they were, quote, inebriated, end quote, and claimed to be a, quote, fighter from California, end quote, before going to retrieve a rifle from a car. The victims reportedly took themselves to local hospitals where they reportedly are in stable condition. This is according to The Guardian and CNN. Number 10, Warner Brothers delays Tenet release by 2 weeks. Warner Brothers announced on Friday that Christopher Nolan's Tenet, which was set to be the first big blockbuster movie released in theaters after they widely reopened following coronavirus closures, is being delayed by 2 weeks, with a new release set for July 31st. Tenet had been scheduled to open July 17th, and the studio didn't push it from that date even as other big summer films abandoned their releases when theaters closed. It thus became the blockbuster that would welcome audiences back to theaters should theaters actually be able to widely reopen by mid-July after closing due to the pandemic. Though in recent weeks, questions swirled about whether that timeline was feasible and whether Warner Brothers would be forced to abandon the date. This is according to the New York Times and The Week. That's 10 things you need to know today for Saturday, June 13th, 2020. Thank you so much for listening. I hope everyone's doing reasonably well. Drop me some comments. Let me know what you think. Subscribe and comment and give 5-star reviews and all that kind of thing. Also, if you'd like to tell your story or hear the stories of others, I encourage you to check out my other podcast, What Makes You Famous. Find it everywhere using the hashtag What Makes You Famous. That's it for me. It's Keys Dan, RadioWhat.com. DJLittleRock.com. Peace. I'm out of here. Peace. I'm out of here. If you like what you hear, I encourage you to follow What Makes You Smarter on social media. Find it on Facebook at What Makes You Smarter, Instagram at What Makes You Smarter, Twitter at SmarterWhat, and YouTube, username Keys Dan. Leave What Makes You Smarter podcast a review and subscribe. Listen to What Makes You Smarter podcast on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Podcast Addict. My personal favorite, learn with me on my podcast, What Makes You Smarter. And if you'd like to tell your story, I encourage you to check out my other podcast, What Makes You Famous. Find it everywhere using the hashtag What Makes You Famous. Call 501-470-6386 and leave a message to set up a time for What Makes You Famous. Support What Makes You Smarter podcast using the PayPal, paypal.me/KeysDan. Email info@radiowhat.com. What Makes You Smarter is a production of Keys Dan Enterprises Incorporated at keysdan.com. Thank you for listening.